Hey, this is Off the Cuff, and I'm Steve from TorahFamily.org. Today, we're continuing in our teaching series, Torah 101, a series covering topics that give the basics and how we can all pursue the Torah as given by Yahweh. This series is for new believers or even for sharing with those who are interested in learning. This is part 3 of 3 in our teaching on the Sabbath. In part 1, we discussed the element of how the Sabbath still applies to the modern day we live in. Today, we're picking up from where we left off in part 2 regarding how to properly observe it. We closed out with how we shouldn't buy on the Sabbath. Now, picking up from there, this often brings up the question, what about making online purchases on the Sabbath? Because, in reality, no one is working. It's simply a digital transaction being made that normally isn't even processed until the following Monday. This topic can go either way, depending on who you talk to. We've seen good discussions going both ways. And honestly, we believe you need to work that out between you and the Father. Now, on a different topic, what about the Sabbath day's journey? I've had several people, those who don't pursue the Torah, tell me that I can't travel farther than a Sabbath day's journey on the Sabbath day. I then ask where that's found in the Torah. And the normal response is something like, well, I don't know, but I know it's in there somewhere. This is a perfect example of someone quoting man and not the Torah. Nowhere in the Torah do we find any instruction regarding a Sabbath day's journey. It's just not there. So, where does that phrase come from? Acts 1:12. Then they returned to Jerusalem from the hill called the Mount of Olives, a Sabbath day's walk from the city. The phrase Sabbath day's walk actually came from the Pharisees' oral law that later became known as the Talmud. Some would point to this scripture in saying that the disciples were adhering to this law out of obedience to the Sabbath day. However, this verse is simply showing a distance by a commonly used measure. It doesn't mean the followers were keeping a Pharisaical tradition. What we do find is this verse, Exodus 16:29. Remain each of you in his place. Let no one go out of his place on the seventh day. The Pharisees wanted to define how far a man could go out on the Sabbath without breaking this command in Exodus. This is because the word place could be defined in many different ways. So, they invented a Sabbath day's walk, which was about a mile. However, to understand the context of this verse, we need to read the previous verses. The context is all about going out of your homes to gather manna. Consider Exodus 16, verse 26. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the seventh day, which is a Sabbath, there will be none. On the seventh day, some of the people went out to gather, but they found none. And Yahweh said to Moses, how long will you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? So, what do we see here? The people went out of their homes to do what? To gather manna after they were told not to. Now, let's read the rest. Exodus 16:29. See, Yahweh has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, on the sixth day, he gives you bread for 2 days. Remain each of you in his place. Let no one go out of his place on the seventh day. The whole point was to not go out and gather manna. It wasn't regarding anything else. It was specifically mentioned for that reason and that reason alone. They were to gather what they needed for 2 days on the sixth day and not go out and get more on the Sabbath. In essence, gathering the manna would be likened to harvesting wheat from the field, if you will. And Yahweh said there would be none of that on the Sabbath. Now, this actually brings up two different topics: cooking on the Sabbath and traveling on the Sabbath. Let's cover traveling first. In our current opinion, we really don't want to travel so far that we wear ourselves out, and that can easily happen. Now, this will vary with each individual, I know, but the Sabbath is all about rest, so just keep that in mind. I know today we have vehicles, and we can travel so much farther while exerting far less energy than that of walking. So this comes down to seeking the Father on what He wants of you. But what if your job requires you to travel on the Sabbath? I have a friend whose job requires him to travel occasionally on weekends. He makes it a point to put the "Do Not Bother" sign on his hotel door all day long on the Sabbath, just to make sure no one cleans his room. He goes the extra mile to make no one work for him on that day. So, even when traveling, you can keep people from working for you. Now, regarding cooking on the Sabbath, this is a big topic for many. So let's look at the verses that's often used regarding this. It's actually in the same context about the manna that we read earlier. It's regarding the double portion that was collected on the sixth day. Exodus 16, verse 23. He said to them, "This is what Yahweh commanded. Tomorrow is to be a day of rest, a holy Sabbath to Yahweh. So bake what you want to bake, and boil what you want to boil. Save whatever is left, and keep it until morning." There are two schools of thought on this verse. One, it seems we're instructed that all food preparations for the Sabbath is to be done on the previous day. Thus, no cooking on the Sabbath. Let's discuss this view first. While this seems to be the dominant view of those who pursue Torah, I believe we need to remember that preparing food back then was much different from today. When one was going to cook back then, they started with virtually nothing and made just about everything from scratch. So cooking wasn't exactly easy. Thus, why many believe they were instructed to plan ahead before the Sabbath. But today, things are truly easier when it comes to food preparations. I mean, think of it. Take a frozen dish you might buy at the grocery store. In order to prepare that dish, all you do is preheat the oven and then place it in for maybe 45 minutes or so. And that's it. Next thing you know, dinner is on the table. One would be hard-pressed to call that work. However, even with all the modern appliances and cooking utensils we may have today, preparing a meal in the kitchen can still be a lot, if we allow it. Though I don't personally consider making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich work in the kitchen. Preparing a full-course meal, on the other hand, well, that could be something different. Thus, why many hold to this view. This is something one needs to approach from a servant's heart. I've spoken with many who started making something that they considered to be, well, easy to do on the Sabbath. Yet, when they were done making it, they confessed they said to themselves, "Never again." And this is what I call growing. Now, let's read the verse again to consider the other view regarding the double portion of the collected manna on the sixth day. Again, Exodus 16:23. He said to them, "This is what Yahweh commanded. Tomorrow is to be a day of rest, a holy Sabbath to Yahweh. So, bake what you want to bake, and boil what you want to boil. Save whatever is left, and keep it until morning." This can be easily understood as bake what you want to bake, and boil what you want to boil of what you collected, meaning you don't have to bake all of it. Whatever is left from the manna that isn't baked or boiled is simply kept until Sabbath morning. Remember, throughout the week, they were told to gather every morning and not keep any of it overnight. When some tried keeping it till morning, it was filled with maggots. This is seen in verses 19 and 20. But here we see the double portion collected would be good in the morning for them to make something else. And remember, it isn't bake or boil all of it. It's bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil. It's what you want, meaning for that Friday. Then save the rest of the manna, that which you didn't want to make on Friday, until morning, because it will stay good for you overnight compared to the other nights. Thus, this is the one day you can keep the manna overnight, and it would still be good the next morning for you to prepare something with it. Now, one can easily read this verse and see it as bake or boil all of it. Then leave the leftovers until morning. However, it could just as easily be referencing the uncooked manna for the next day, as it wouldn't be filled with maggots like the other days. A debate could be made that if all the manna was baked or boiled, that would be the reason it wouldn't be filled with maggots, because it was cooked. Thus, they were to bake or boil all of it. However, wouldn't that be true the other 6 days? Of course. And I'm sure there could have been leftovers of what was made on those days. But any uncooked manna would have been filled with maggots, the unused portion they intended to use the next day. But on the Sabbath, the remaining manna would be good for cooking, showing this day to be different. So, there's 2 different schools of thought here. Not allowed to cook or allowed to cook. I'll tell you where we stand, but remember, you need to seek the Father on this for you. We're of the second viewpoint, that cooking is allowed on the Sabbath. To give added support for our understanding, please consider what happened with Peter's mother-in-law in Luke 4. The context starts in verse 31, showing it was the Sabbath. Then we go 7 verses down to see what happens right after he leaves the synagogue on that Sabbath. Luke 4:38. Jesus left the synagogue and went to Simon's house. Simon's mother-in-law was very sick. She had a high fever. They asked Jesus to do something to help her. He stood very close to her and ordered the sickness to go away. The sickness left her, and she got up and began serving them. So, she immediately gets up and starts serving them on the Sabbath the moment she was healed by Yeshua. So, Yeshua heals her on the Sabbath, and then right in front of Yeshua, she starts serving them, even Yeshua himself. How would she have served them on the Sabbath? They've been gone most of the day at the synagogue. So, more than likely, she began cooking for them on the Sabbath. It seems that would be the one thing she could do by way of serving them on the Sabbath. And for what it's worth, cooking is therapy for some people, and maybe that's you. Remember, Sabbath was made for man, not man for Sabbath. You need to do what brings you rest and relaxation, physically and mentally. But what about the everyday mom? How does a housewife rest on the Sabbath? Obviously, their primary job is to take care of the children. How can she possibly feel that a certain day is for rest or set apart from the rest of the week? Yes, children need to be cared for, and animals need to be cared for as well, especially if you live on a farm. However, toilets don't need to be scrubbed. Laundry can wait, and the floors don't have to be swept. There are ways to minimize it down to set the day apart. The dishes, they can wait. The beds, they can stay a mess. There's no need to sweat the small stuff. Planning ahead and pitching in together at the end makes the Sabbath an awesome day for everyone. It's best to work together to get as much done during the week so you can have the day to really enjoy your children. Lots of time for play, stories, art, etc. A day to focus on Yahweh and your family without the busyness of life and work. What better way to teach the love of Yahweh to your young children than to delight in them? Now, switching gears here, something we must never forget is how the Sabbath is a day to include a time of a sacred assembly. Consider Leviticus 23, verse 3. There are 6 days when you may work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath of rest, a day of sacred assembly. You are not to do any work wherever you live. It is a Sabbath to Yahweh. This is where we learn and grow with one another, where we share our previous week, our triumphs, and our needs. This is where we learn to become the body, as Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians 12. Truly, no man is an island. We're all created with a need for others. The Sabbath is where we learn to understand that need. It's where we learn we all have different perspectives of the Word of Yahweh. Some may be right and some may be wrong. And so we read Proverbs 27:17. As iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. So, can we meet on other days? Well, of course. But the Sabbath is the one day the Father desires His people to gather on. Now, a debate could be brought up in saying how Yeshua would have broke this command during His 40 days of fasting, since He was out in the wilderness for the whole time. And this is where we need to understand what the phrase sacred assembly or holy convocation means. Just as much as it can mean for a large gathering of believers to come together, it can also mean for a literal one-on-one with Yahweh. That's what makes it holy. It's to make sure you set the time aside to be with Him. Just as much as we need times to be with other believers, we need those times to just be alone with the Father and rest in Him as well. A holy convocation with the Father, just you and Him. Whether there's people all around you or you're alone in the wilderness, He desires a holy convocation between us and Him. He provided the day. We make sure it happens. We know some have no fellow believers in their local area. This makes it virtually impossible to gather with others. Many watch fellowships who have their services online, and that's definitely better than nothing. But don't stop looking for other believers in your area. Though meeting with others online is nice, nothing beats meeting with like-minded believers face to face. So, having said all this, just when is the Sabbath? A biblical day is sundown to sundown. Thus, the Sabbath is from sundown Friday night to sundown Saturday night. While there are differences of opinion on this topic, we simply point to the covenant Yahweh made with Abraham. Genesis 15:17. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day Yahweh made a covenant with Abram, saying, Yahweh waited until darkness fully covered the land before He made the covenant with Abram. Then, verse 18 says, on that day Yahweh made a covenant with Abram. So he waited for darkness to cover the land, for the night to start the new day. In fact, it was at nighttime when it says on that day, showing the night is indeed part of the day. And because he waited for the night to cover the land, it shows he waited for the new day to start at night. To give further confirmation that the night started the next day, let's look at history. The night before, we see Abram save Lot and the king of Sodom. The next morning, we see Melchizedek come on the scene and Abram give his 10%. Then we see Yahweh and Abram discussing how Abram has no children. Then Yahweh told him to count the stars if he could, and that would be the amount of his descendants. But he couldn't count the stars because, well, it was daytime. But Abram believed Yahweh, and he gave credit to him as righteousness. Abram then prepares the sacrifices for the covenant. Yahweh then has Abram fall into a deep sleep. Then we see Yahweh wait until darkness covered the land to make the covenant. He waited till the next day. It was the next day Yahweh made the covenant, starting at that night. So, how does all this point to when a day starts? You'll see. Galatians 3:17 says, "What I mean is this: the law, introduced 430 years later, does not set aside the covenant previously established by God, and thus do away with the promise." Paul is saying the law, as written through Moses, was given exactly 430 years from the time of the covenant. 430 years. Now, read this. Exodus 12:40. Now, the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of the 430 years, to the very day, all Yahweh's divisions left Egypt. 430 years to the very day. Well, what day did Israel leave Egypt? They left on the first day of unleavened bread, the morning after the Passover was eaten. Now, look at the sequence of events with Abram. They overlap with the deliverance in Egypt. On the night of Passover, a conquering happens. The next morning, a deliverance happens. Then we see Yahweh wait until darkness covers the land to make the covenant with Abram. So, the covenant started on the second day of unleavened bread. Then, a complete 430 years later lands on the first day of unleavened bread, the day Israel was delivered from Egypt. Exactly 430 years to the day, as Moses said. Not 430 years in a day. It was 430 years to the day. 430 completed years. Thus, Yahweh waited for the darkness to cover the land to start the second day of unleavened bread, to make the covenant with Abram, showing a day truly starts at sundown for Yahweh. For clarification on these numbers, we suggest watching the short teaching titled, "How Long Were the Israelites in Egypt?" It's at the bottom of all of our daily devotions. The element of a day starting at sundown is confirmed with Nehemiah chapter 13. Verse 19 says, "When evening shadows fell on the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I ordered the doors to be shut and not opened until the Sabbath was over." There are some who try to argue that no one really knows just which day of the week the seventh day is. Thus, they argue we can now make any day the Sabbath, since there's no way to really know the proper seventh day. However, we know Yeshua had to obey the commands of Yahweh in order to be sinless according to God's law. It doesn't take much to study and realize the first century believers followed Yeshua in observing Saturday as the Sabbath. And it was the Roman Catholic Church that later changed it over to the first day of the week on the calendar that Rome was on, forcing all to abandon the seventh-day Sabbath on Saturday to the first day of the week on Sunday. Now, there are a few that hold to what is called the lunar Sabbath. We'll address that in a completely different teaching. I know some use Isaiah 58 to apply to the Sabbath. However, we believe this chapter, that being again Isaiah 58, is regarding the Day of Atonement. We addressed this chapter in our teaching on the Day of Atonement titled, Afflict Yourself. Regarding the Sabbath, there are many misunderstandings because of what we read from the Pharisees. The Pharisees said Yeshua broke the Sabbath. Consider John 5:18. For this reason, the Jews tried all the harder to kill him. Not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. So, here we see an accusation of Yeshua breaking the Sabbath. What were his actions to make them say he was breaking the Sabbath? The context here is where Yeshua heals a paralytic in telling him to take up his mat and walk. So, in the eyes of the Pharisees, he's breaking the Sabbath in two ways: healing on the Sabbath and telling someone to carry their mat, both of which, to the Pharisees' added commands, was breaking the Sabbath. But this was breaking the Pharisees' added commands and not the law of Yahweh. They added to the Torah, even though they knew Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 2 specifically commands not to. When it came to the topic of healing on the Sabbath, Yeshua set the record and the Pharisees straight. Consider the following. Luke 13, verses 10 through 17. On a Sabbath, Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues, and a woman was there who had been crippled by a spirit for 18 years. She was bent over and could not straighten up at all. When Jesus saw her, he called her forward and said to her, "Woman, you are set free from your infirmity." Then he put his hands on her, and immediately she straightened up and praised God. Indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, the synagogue ruler said to the people, "There are 6 days for work, so come and be healed on those days, not on the Sabbath." Then the Lord answered him, "You hypocrites! Doesn't each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or donkey from the stall and lead it out to give it water? Then should not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has kept bound for 18 long years, be set free on the Sabbath day from what bound her?" When he said this, all the opponents were humiliated, but the people were delighted with all the wonderful things he was doing. There are many assumptions made by people regarding what they believe concerning the Sabbath, or any of God's instructions for that matter. The problem is that many of these assumptions are based on man-made rules that's been passed down through the ages and not on the word of Yahweh. So we ask that you be mindful to what you hold to. Be sure it's based in the scriptures and not tradition. If there's a difference of opinion on any particular verse, that's okay. We can all learn and grow from there. At least we'll be founded on the scripture and not tradition passed down from the fathers of the faith. As long as we all have a humble heart before the Father, He'll lead us into His truth. Our goal should be to grow in the Word of God, not the word of man. In discussing this topic with a friend, he responded with the phrase, but it's just not convenient to go to church on Saturday or to observe the Sabbath as such, which I could only think in my heart. So now we're serving God out of convenience and not obedience. I couldn't help but think of the verse found in 1 Chronicles 21:24. But King David replied to Araunah, "No, I insist on paying the full price. I will not take for Yahweh what is yours, or sacrifice a burnt offering that costs me nothing." Do you serve God on your terms or His? Do you serve Him in convenience or obedience? Let's face it, observing the Sabbath is not a popular thing in this world. We live in such a fast-paced society where stopping, well, it just seems so foreign to us. But it's truly the best for us. It's for our benefit. The Sabbath helps us to be still before Yahweh, to quiet our hearts and listen. I have to confess, it was hard for my wife and I to get used to it at the beginning, simply because, well, we live in Egypt, if you will. We were simply used to living that lifestyle, fast-paced, always moving, working for the weekend, if you will. We were simply used to going here and going there, buying this and buying that. I mean, that's what everyone does, right? Doing chores around the house, just doing what everyone else would do. In fact, the first couple of Sabbaths, after reading some and resting some, well, we actually found ourselves just twiddling our thumbs saying, "What now?" The mere fact that we were struggling with it showed we had been blending in all that time beforehand and not being set apart, not setting that day apart. Yet now we wouldn't trade it for anything, seriously. It's the one day that's truly set aside, and we love it. There are many things you can do to make it a special day for you and your family. We pray the Father helps you as you do just that. Make it a special day, a day set apart unto Him. As you do, others will think it's strange that you go out of your way to not go to the store, that you make it a day of rest and not chores, that you make it a day set apart. And trust me when I say, when it comes to observing the Sabbath, you will stand out in the eyes of others. But are we supposed to do that? Remember, the Sabbath is a sign between us and Yahweh. It's the lasting covenant He's given us. Let's make it our desire to renew that covenant with the Father, so the whole world will have no doubt as to who we belong to. We're so far removed from knowing how everything is to be observed that we can only do our best and keep our hearts open to the Father as we pursue His ways. May our goal be to pursue His ways and not justify our own. One day soon, all the questions that surround so many topics like this will be answered for all of us. But until then, we must pursue in a purity of heart and pray we work out our salvation with fear and trembling. Well, that's all I have. Think about it. Pray about it. But more than anything, be a doer of the word and not a hearer only. Until next time, Shalom.